In the winter of 1942, as armies collided across 3 continents, a quieter war was already being fought, and lost, on graph paper. The pencil lines drawn in Berlin would mock reality until reality crossed them, irreversibly, and turned arithmetic into destiny. Berlin, December 14, 1942, Wilhelmstrasse, Speer Ministry basement. The room smelled of damp concrete and cigarette ash. 4 hanging bulbs cast shallow pools of light across a steel table covered in charts. Rolf Wagenfuhr, statistician to the Reich Ministry of Armaments, pinned the latest American production figures to a corkboard already thick with overlapping graphs. His fingers were stained with carbon from the mimeograph. Liberty ships per month, U-boat sinkings, truck output, Bolero tonnage projections, aviation fuel availability, bomber and escort production rates, lines rising, lines falling, lines that crossed or promised to cross somewhere in the future, if the numbers were real. Colonel Erich Manstein leaned over the table, squinting at a curve labeled U.S. Maritime Commission, Projected Deliveries. The line climbed steeply, impossibly, from 12 ships in January to 50 by summer. He dragged a thick red grease pencil across it, slashing the projection in 2. American propaganda, he said. His breath fogged in the cold air. Optimistic nonsense. The other officers murmured agreement. One of them, a logistics major from OKW, tapped a finger on the U-boat sinking chart. We're bleeding them faster than they can build. The Atlantic is ours. Wagenfuhr said nothing. He adjusted his glasses and smoothed the corner of a fuel consumption graph. The pencil in his hand hovered over an empty axis, waiting. They didn't know the future was already plotted. Above them, Berlin slept under blackout curtains. Across the North Sea, in shipyards from Maine to California, welders worked 3 shifts under arc lights that turned night into noon. Keels were being laid every week. Hulls were being launched every day. The lines on Wagenfuhr's charts were not propaganda. They were prophecy. But prophecy only matters when someone believes it. Manstein folded the American report and dropped it into a steel wastebasket. If they could build like this, he said, they wouldn't need to lie about it. Wagenfuhr watched him leave. The door clanged shut, the bulbs swung slightly in the draft, and the shadows of the graphs danced across the wall like the rigging of invisible ships. He returned to his table. The pencil moved again, tracing a new axis, tons delivered versus tons sunk. For now, the German line sat above the Allied line. For now. But Wagenfuhr had learned something in 2 years of collating reports from the front, the factories, the fuel depots, the rail yards. Numbers do not care about belief. They do not pause for doubt. They move. And when 2 lines cross, only one can stay on top. He pinned the final chart, a projection of Allied logistical capacity through 1944, and stepped back. The trajectories were clear. Merchant tonnage would outpace sinkings by spring. Truck production would outstrip Wehrmacht mobility by summer. Fuel delivery would overwhelm synthetic output by autumn. 3 crossovers. 3 irreversible moments. Manstein's red X was still visible on the Liberty ship curve, a gesture of disbelief frozen in wax. Wagenfuhr did not erase it. He simply drew a new line beside it, in blue ink, and labeled it Actual. The room was silent except for the hum of a single radiator and the scratch of the pencil on paper. Outside, in the rail yards and the dock yards and the assembly plants of a still-sleeping continent, the future was already being built, not in speeches, not in declarations, but in the cold algebra of production, transportation, and supply. The war would be decided not by the brilliance of generals or the courage of soldiers, but by the slope of a line and the moment it crossed another. Wagenfuhr capped his pen. He looked at the charts one last time, then turned off 3 of the 4 lights. In the remaining glow, the graphs looked almost peaceful, static, theoretical, safe. They would not stay that way for long. Across the Atlantic, the first of 2,910 Liberty ships was already at sea. In Detroit, the assembly lines were retooling for a new kind of war, one measured not in victories, but in vehicles per hour. In Britain, depots were filling with mountains of supplies that had no immediate battlefield, but would soon become the foundation of an invasion. the lines were moving. And in 6 months, the first crossover would arrive, not as a theory, not as a projection, but as an inescapable fact written in saltwater, steel, and the wreckage of a strategy that had mistaken confidence for mathematics. Wagenfeuer locked the basement door behind him and climbed the stairs into the frozen December night. Somewhere in the darkness, a pencil's work was becoming a convoy's course. A slide rule's arc was becoming a tanker's wake. The future was not being written, it was being drawn, and no Red X could stop it. Atlantic Theater, January-April 1943. The ocean was a graveyard measured in tonnage. Every week, U-boats prowled the convoy lanes between New York and Liverpool, and every week the numbers arrived at Wilhelmstrasse in neat columns. Ships sunk, cargo lost, crews drowned. In the first quarter of 1943, German submarines sent over 500,000 tons to the bottom. The mathematics seemed unassailable. Admiral Dönitz commanded more than 400 U-boats, and his crews were hunting in coordinated wolf packs, guided by B-Dienst decrypts of Allied routing signals. The strategic assumption was simple: sink ships faster than they can be built, and Britain starves. Cut the Atlantic line, and the war ends before the Americans can cross it in meaningful numbers. The assumption rested on a single belief: that industrial capacity has limits, and those limits are knowable. But in the winter of 1943, those limits were being rewritten in shipyards that ran 24 hours a day, where welders no longer riveted hulls but fused them, where Liberty ships slid down the ways in 45 days instead of 6 months. Wagenfeuer's charts showed the divergence beginning in late 1942, but the officers who reviewed them saw only optimism, not trend lines. The American curves climbed too steeply to be credible. No nation could build that fast. No supply chain could sustain that tempo. So the Red X remained, slashed across the projection, and the convoys kept dying. In March, a single wolf pack sank 21 ships in 5 days. The convoy routes shifted south, then north, chasing safety that no longer existed. Escort destroyers were too few. Air cover ended 600 miles from shore, leaving a gap in the mid-Atlantic where submarines rose and struck and vanished. The killing continued. The tonnage mounted. And in Berlin, confidence hardened into certainty. But certainty is not the same as correctness. On the Allied side, 3 quiet transformations were underway. Transformations that would not appear on a battlefield, but would decide every battlefield to come. The first was scale. In California, Oregon, and Maine, Kaiser's shipyards were perfecting the art of mass production applied to ocean-going vessels. Prefabricated hull sections arrived by rail. Cranes lifted them into place. Welding teams moved in assembly line precision. What had once taken a year now took weeks. By April, Liberty ship production was exceeding 40 hulls per month. The line on the graph was no longer a projection. It was a tide. The second transformation was technology. Escort carriers, small, slow, built on merchant hulls, began appearing in convoys, carrying swordfish and wildcat aircraft that could hunt submarines beyond the range of land-based patrol bombers. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF called Huff Duff by the sailors who used it, allowed escorts to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions and close before the submarines could submerge. Radar sets grew smaller, more reliable, more widespread. What had been experimental in 1942 was standard by the spring of 1943. The third transformation was subtler and deadlier. The Allies had cracked the German naval enigma codes, and though they could not read every message, they could read enough. Convoy routes shifted not randomly, but intelligently, steering away from known wolf pack positions. The hunters were being hunted by their own transmissions. None of this was visible in a single engagement. No battle announced the shift. But the lines were moving. In April, sinkings began to fall. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough to show a flattening in the curve. In the Speer Ministry basement, Wagenfeuer updated his charts and noted the change with a single pencil mark. He did not mention it in his summary report. Numbers alone do not convince men who have already decided what to believe. But the ocean was keeping its own ledger. On April 30th, convoy ONS-5 fought its way through a storm, and a wolf pack ambush in the North Atlantic. 13 merchant ships were lost. But 6 U-boats were sunk in return, and the convoy reached port with the bulk of its cargo intact. The exchange rate had changed. For 2 years, U-boats had been sinking Allied tonnage faster than it could be replaced. For 2 years, the destruction line had been above the construction line. Now, in the sleet and darkness of the mid-Atlantic, the lines were converging, and convergence is only the prelude to the crossing. Meanwhile, in Detroit, another line was rising. Assembly plants that had once built sedans and coupes were now stamping out military trucks at a rate the Wehrmacht's logisticians had never imagined possible. GMC, Chevrolet, Dodge, Studebaker, names that meant nothing to Wagenführer's staff, were producing over 25,000 vehicles per month. These were not tanks, they were not glamorous. But they represented something more dangerous than firepower. They represented mobility that did not depend on rail lines or horses or captured fuel depots. Trucks could go anywhere a road existed, and where no road existed, they made one. By spring, over 500,000 American trucks had been built, and thousands were being loaded onto Liberty ships bound for Britain. There, in depots across the Midlands and the South Coast, another kind of line was forming. Not a graph, but a queue of steel and rubber stretching across fields and warehouses. Operation Bolero, the build-up of men and materiel for an eventual cross-channel invasion, was no longer theoretical. It was inventory in motion, tonnage on shelves, capacity in waiting. In Germany, the assumption remained that logistics would be the Allies' weakness. The English Channel was narrow, but supplying an army across it would require ports, and ports could be destroyed or defended. An invasion might land, but it could not be sustained. The assumption was logical. It was based on historical precedent, and it was obsolete, because the Allies were not planning to rely on ports, they were planning to build them. In workshops across southern England, engineers were fabricating the components of Mulberry, artificial harbors that could be towed across the channel and assembled on open beaches, pierheads, floating roadways, breakwaters made from sunken ships and concrete caissons. No one in Berlin knew. The intelligence reports mentioned unusual construction activity, but the scale and purpose remained hidden. The line between theory and capability was invisible until the moment it materialized. And that moment was coming. By the end of April 1943, 3 trajectories were locked. Merchant ship construction would soon exceed sinkings. Truck production would soon exceed the Wehrmacht's entire motor pool. Pre-positioned supplies in Britain would soon exceed the Wehrmacht's strategic reserves. The numbers were moving. The lines were closing. And in the cold algebra of modern war, once a line crosses, it rarely crosses back. Wagenführer updated his charts in silence. He saw the convergence. He noted the dates. He made no predictions in writing, only observations. But late at night, alone in the basement under Wilhelmstrasse, he would sometimes hold a pencil over the graph and trace the future. The moment when the Allied line would rise above the German line and stay there. The moment when arithmetic would become destiny. That moment was 6 weeks away. The Atlantic, May 1943, the first crossover. The sea was black under low cloud, and the convoy moved through it like a city adrift. 42 merchant ships in 9 columns, flanked by corvettes and destroyers, whose wakes drew white lines across the darkness. Escort carrier HMS Biter sailed in the center, her flight deck empty in the pre-dawn cold. This was convoy HX-237, eastbound from New York to Liverpool, carrying tanks, trucks, aviation fuel, and 10,000 tons of grain. On paper, it was cargo. In practice, it was the arithmetic of survival. Somewhere beneath the surface, U-boats waited. Intelligence had warned of a patrol line south of Iceland. The convoy altered course twice during the night, steering toward gaps in the wolf pack that existed only as coordinates on a decrypted signal. At 0600 hours, Biter launched 2 swordfish biplanes. Fabric and wood, obsolete by any measure except the one that mattered. They could fly low, slow, and long, and their radar could see a submarine's conning tower at 4 miles. 1 hour later, U-45P6 surfaced to recharge batteries, and was caught in the open by a swordfish that had been circling just beyond visual range. Depth charges bracketed the hull. The submarine dove but never resurfaced. 49 men died without seeing the aircraft that killed them. It was one loss in a war of attrition. But attrition is decided not by single engagements, but by the rate of replacement versus the rate of destruction. And in May 1943, that rate inverted. By month's end, German U-boats had sunk 50 Allied ships, 35,000 tons per vessel, roughly 500,000 tons total. The number was significant. The trend line was catastrophic, because in the same month, 41 U-boats were lost. Hunted by aircraft, tracked by Huff Duff, ambushed by escort groups that had learned to operate as coordinated strike forces rather than scattered guards. Dönitz called it Black May. His crews called it slaughter. The numbers were simple and irreversible. Germany could build 2 U-boats per month for everyone lost at that rate. The Allies were building 50 Liberty ships per month for every 10 sunk. The destruction line and the construction line had crossed. And they would never cross back. Wagenfeuer updated his charts on June 2nd. The intersection was visible, undeniable. He drew a small circle around the month of May and wrote a single word in the margin: Kipppunkt, tipping point. No one in the ministry asked what it meant. Detroit and beyond, mobility as moving stock. While convoys crossed the ocean, another line was accelerating on factory floors across the American Midwest. In Detroit, Flint, South Bend, and Los Angeles, assembly plants converted from civilian production operated at a tempo that defied pre-war logic. The GMC CCKW, known simply as the Jimmy, rolled off the lines at a rate of 1 every 7 minutes, 2.5-ton capacity, 6-wheel drive, capable of fording 3 feet of water and climbing grades that would immobilize a staff car. By mid-1943, American truck production exceeded 300,000 units per year. The number was staggering not because of what it represented on a balance sheet, but because of what it represented on a road. Last-mile logistics that did not depend on capturing rail junctions or commandeering enemy fuel stocks. The Wehrmacht moved by rail and horse. When rail lines were cut, entire divisions stalled. When fuel ran short, mobility collapsed. German logistics was a line anchored to fixed infrastructure. Allied logistics was a network of vehicles that could follow an advance across any terrain with a trafficable surface, and many without. In England, thousands of trucks arrived weekly on Liberty ships, were unloaded by cranes working around the clock, and were staged in depots from Kent to Cornwall. Massive formations of vehicles parked in rows so long they resembled rail yards without the rails. Inventory in motion, stock on wheels. Manstein had once dismissed this as inefficiency, scattering assets across the landscape instead of concentrating them on strategic rail hubs. He did not understand that dispersion was the strategy. A destroyed rail yard paralyzes an army. A destroyed truck costs 1 truck. The line between centralized logistics and distributed logistics was the line between fragility and resilience, and by summer 1943, that line had been crossed as decisively as the Atlantic sinking curve. Britain summer 1943, warehousing victory. In warehouses across southern England, supplies accumulated in quantities that no campaign had ever assembled in advance of battle. Ammunition by the trainload, rations by the ton, medical supplies, spare parts, bridging equipment, engineering stores, entire depots dedicated to materiel that would not be used for months, perhaps a year. Operation Bolero was transforming Britain into a garrison and a depot simultaneously. Millions of tons pre-positioned. Mulberry Harbor components fabricated and staged near embarkation ports. Discharge capacity calculated down to the pallet and the hour. Before the first shot was fired on a French beach, victory was sitting on a shelf. The German General Staff assumed that logistics would constrain any Allied invasion. Ports would be contested, destroyed, or insufficient. An army might land, but sustaining it would require capturing Le Havre or Cherbourg intact and operational within days. The assumption was correct if the Allies fought by conventional rules. But the Allies were not planning to fight by conventional rules. They were planning to bring their own ports. Mulberry Harbors, massive, modular, prefabricated, were being built in secrecy. Concrete caissons the size of apartment buildings, floating steel roadways, pierheads capable of handling Liberty ships in open water. The first full-scale tests occurred in Scottish locks, far from German reconnaissance. Engineers measured discharge rates, stress tolerances, storm resilience. The results were compiled, refined, and fed into planning models that calculated supply flow as precisely as factory output. This was logistics as engineering, victory as a solved equation. Wegenfuhr received fragmentary intelligence reports in August. Unusual construction activity, large concrete structures of unknown purpose, abnormal shipping movements along the Scottish coast. He filed them under unconfirmed and noted the pattern without drawing conclusions. But the pattern was a line, and the line was pointing toward a beach that did not yet have a name. Fuel lines. The invisible war. Armies move on fuel. Aircraft require octane. Tanks require diesel. Trucks require gasoline. The side that controls fuel production controls mobility, and mobility is the currency of modern war. In 1943, Germany's fuel situation was precarious. Synthetic production from coal provided a baseline, but it was expensive, slow, and vulnerable to bombing. Romania's Ploiești refineries were the Reich's primary natural source, producing 30% of Germany's fuel supply. The Allies targeted both. On August 1, 1943, Operation Tidal Wave, a daylight raid by American B-24 Liberators, struck Ploiești. The attack cost 54 bombers and was hailed as a failure. But the refineries burned for weeks, and production dropped by half. Meanwhile, another fuel line was being laid that would make Ploiești's loss irrelevant to the Allies and fatal to the Germans. Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was a flexible pipeline designed to pump fuel directly from England to France after the invasion. Engineers tested prototypes in the Thames estuary and the Bristol Channel, refining pressure tolerances and joint seals. At the same time, T2 tankers, mass-produced in American yards, began crossing the Atlantic in increasing numbers, carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels of high-octane aviation fuel refined in Texas, Louisiana, and California. Fuel was no longer a constraint. It was a logistical output, scheduled and delivered with the precision of any other commodity. Germany's fuel curve was falling, the Allied fuel curve was rising, and when those lines crossed, the Luftwaffe would lose not because of pilot skill, but because planes cannot fly without gasoline, and determination cannot burn in an empty tank. By autumn, the divergence was measurable. Allied bomber formations operated with fuel reserves that allowed for diversions, second attempts, and extended patrol. German interceptors scrambled with enough fuel for one pass, perhaps two, before returning to base on fumes. The line between abundance and scarcity had crossed, and it was drawn in octane. The arithmetic of replacement. In the air war over Germany, courage was abundant on both sides. Skill was high. But courage and skill are finite resources if they cannot be replaced. The Luftwaffe lost pilots faster than it could train new ones. Each ace shot down represented hundreds of hours of experience that could not be recreated in the abbreviated training programs of 1943. German pilot schools cut training time from 18 months to 6, then to 4. The result was predictable. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal formation flying, inadequate gunnery practice, and almost no instrument time. They died in their first or second missions. Meanwhile, Allied pilot training expanded. American and Commonwealth flight schools operated across the United States, Canada, and Southern Africa, far from enemy action. Training pipelines produced pilots faster than combat consumed them. Losses were replaced. Experience accumulated. In the factories, the same dynamic prevailed. Germany built excellent aircraft, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, but in numbers that could not keep pace with attrition. The United States built good aircraft, P-47s, P-51s, B-17s, in numbers that overwhelmed attrition. By late 1943, the production line had crossed the loss line, and the gap was widening. Replacement beats excellence when the war lasts long enough for excellence to be depleted. The lines had crossed. The numbers did not lie. And in a basement in Berlin, a statistician updated his charts and wondered if anyone with authority to act was reading them. Normandy, June 6, 1944. Lines made real. The beach was chaos translated into tonnage. Landing craft spilled trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and men onto sand, churned by shell craters and tide. UKWs, amphibious trucks, shuttled between ships and shore, their wheels finding traction on shingle that had been mapped and tested months earlier. Overhead, a sky crowded with aircraft, fighters providing cover, bombers pounding inland defenses, transports dropping paratroopers behind the Atlantic Wall. The air war was no longer a contest. It was domination written in sortie rates. And offshore, beyond the chaos, the Mulberry harbors were already en route. Within 48 hours of the first landing, concrete caissons were being towed into position off Arromanches and Saint Laurent. By June 9th, the first pierheads were operational. By June 19th, Liberty ships were unloading directly onto floating roadways that led to French soil. The discharge rate exceeded 7,000 tons per day, more than the planners had predicted, more than any natural port in France could have handled in the first weeks of an invasion. A port that did not exist on June 5th was outperforming ports that had existed for centuries. This was logistics as engineered inevitability, and the line it drew, from ship to shore to supply dump to front, was smoother, faster, and more resilient than anything the Wehrmacht could disrupt. German artillery shelled the beaches. Luftwaffe bombers attempted night raids. But the discharge continued. The tonnage mounted. The arithmetic did not pause for resistance. Within a month, over 500,000 tons of supplies had been landed. Fuel, ammunition, rations, vehicles, spare parts, medical supplies, everything an army needs to fight, itemized and delivered on schedule. The beachhead became a depot. The depot became a base. And the base became the anchor of a logistical network that extended backward across the Atlantic and forward into France. Meanwhile, across that network, another line was forming, one that would define the campaign's mobility and reveal its only temporary limit. The Red Ball Express, a line in motion. By late July, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. Patton's Third Army raced east, covering distances in days that had taken weeks in the First World War. The German Seventh Army collapsed. Paris was liberated. The Seine was crossed. But speed consumes fuel, and fuel must be delivered. The ports were still behind the lines. Cherbourg damaged, Le Havre contested, Antwerp not yet open. The railroads were wrecked, sabotaged by retreating Germans and bombed by advancing Allies. The gap between port and front stretched to 300 miles, then 400. The solution was not sophisticated. It was trucks. On August 25th, the Red Ball Express began operations, a dedicated one-way highway system running from the Normandy beaches to supply depots near the front. 6,000 vehicles, driven around the clock in rotating shifts. 75% of the drivers were black soldiers, largely excluded from combat roles, but essential to every mile the combat units advanced. They drove without headlights at night to avoid Luftwaffe attack. They drove through rain, mud, and sniper fire. They delivered 12,000 tons per day, every day, for 82 consecutive days. The line from depot to division became a pulsing artery of logistics, visible from the air, as a ribbon of dust by day and a blackout column by night. A German quartermaster, captured near Metz in September, was shown a map of the Red Ball route and asked how the Wehrmacht would supply a front that fluid. He studied the map in silence, then handed it back. "We wouldn't," he said. "We couldn't. Logistics is inventory in motion. And motion, at this scale, requires not just vehicles but a system. Traffic control, repair depots, fuel caches, relay points, and a philosophy that prioritizes delivery over preservation. German logistics sought to minimize waste. Allied logistics sought to maximize flow. When a truck broke down on the Red Ball, it was pushed to the roadside and another took its place. The tonnage did not stop, but flow has limits. And in September, those limits arrived. The September pause, when lines touch. By early September, Patton's tanks were within sight of the German border. The race across France had been so swift that fuel consumption outpaced delivery. Columns idled with empty tanks. Divisions that had advanced 50 miles per day now waited for the next fuel convoy. The line between supply and demand had converged again, not because the Allies lacked fuel, but because they had advanced faster than their logistics could extend. The bottleneck was simple. Antwerp. The great port sat at the mouth of the Scheldt estuary, 40 miles inland from the North Sea, capable of handling 10,000 tons per day. But it was in German hands. The estuary was mined. The approaches were fortified. Until Antwerp opened, every gallon of fuel and every round of ammunition had to travel overland from Normandy, 400 miles by truck or damaged rail. Wagenfeuer, now relocated to a bunker complex outside Berlin, received reports of the Allied pause and permitted himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The Americans had outrun their supply lines. Patton's columns were stalled. Montgomery's advance into Holland had slowed. For a brief moment, it seemed the old rules still applied, that logistics could impose limits even on industrial abundance. But the pause was not a reversal. It was a recalculation. Allied engineers repaired rail lines. Pipelines were extended from the coast toward the front. Port capacity at Cherbourg increased, and in late October, after weeks of brutal fighting, the Scheldt estuary was cleared and Antwerp opened. Within days, discharge rates climbed to 12,000 tons per day. Within weeks, the logistical plateau stabilized. The line between consumption and delivery leveled out, not at scarcity, but at sufficiency. The pause had been real, but it was an operational adjustment, not a strategic collapse. The line bent. It did not break. The Ardennes, December 1944. Weather delays planes, not arithmetic. Snow fell on the Ardennes forest, thick and silent. German panzers rolled west through the fog, exploiting the one advantage weather could still provide: air supremacy, grounded by clouds. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last major German offensive of the war, was a gamble predicated on capturing Allied fuel depots before the Panzer's own tanks ran dry. The plan assumed that weather would keep Allied aircraft on the ground long enough for the offensive to reach the Meuse. For 3 days, it worked. German columns advanced. American units retreated or were bypassed. The bulge in the Allied line deepened. But the arithmetic did not change. German fuel reserves were calculated down to the liter. Each Panzer division carried enough fuel for 150 kilometers of travel, enough to reach the Meuse if no resistance was encountered, and no detours were required. Captured fuel depots were essential. Without them, the offensive would stall regardless of tactical success. The depots were never captured. American defenders at Bastogne held. Engineers demolished fuel stocks before retreating. And on December 23rd, the weather cleared. Within hours, Allied aircraft filled the sky. Fighters strafed German columns. Bombers struck supply lines. Transport planes dropped supplies to encircled American units at Bastogne. 600 tons in a single day. The airlift graph spiked upward. The German fuel graph fell to empty. By December 26th, Panzer divisions were abandoning vehicles for lack of fuel. Soldiers walked west, surrendering to American patrols or freezing in the snow. The offensive collapsed not because of a decisive battle, but because the fuel curve had crossed the consumption curve, and there was no reserve. Weather had delayed the inevitable. It had not prevented it. A German fuel officer, interrogated after the offensive failed, was asked what would have been needed to sustain the attack. He looked at the map, at the distances, at the tonnage requirements. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "A miracle," he said, "or an American supply system." The final plateau, spring 1945. By March 1945, Antwerp was handling over 1 million tons of cargo per month. Rail lines across France and Belgium operated at near peacetime capacity. Pipelines pumped fuel from the coast to depots 50 miles behind the Rhine. The logistical network had become a steady-state system, delivering more than the front could consume. The Allied line had reached a plateau, not because it could rise no higher, but because higher was unnecessary. Meanwhile, German logistics had collapsed into terminal decline. Oil refineries were rubble. Rail yards were craters. The Ruhr was encircled. Fuel production had fallen to 15% of 1943 levels. Ammunition plants operated sporadically when power was available. The lines had diverged completely. One side operated from abundance. The other operated from scarcity so severe that divisions dissolved not from combat losses, but from the inability to move, shoot, or eat. In a bunker beneath Berlin, Wagenfeuer filed his final report on March 30, 1945. The charts were clear. The crossovers had occurred in May 1943, June 1944, and October 1944. Atlantic tonnage, beachhead discharge, and deepwater port capacity. Every subsequent German defensive action had been fought on a foundation of arithmetic that no longer supported victory, or even sustained resistance. They had been defeated not by weapons, but by the numbers behind the weapons, not by generals, but by the graphs generals refused to believe. Wagenfeuer closed the folder and locked it in a file cabinet that would burn in the coming weeks. The pencil that had drawn those lines lay on the desk, beside a slide rule that had calculated futures no one had wanted to see. The war was not over, but the outcome had been decided long before the final shot, decided in shipyards and factories, on convoy routes and supply roads, in refineries and depots. The strongest weapon had been the one no one saw, the line that crossed and stayed crossed. The war behind the war. There were no monuments built to the slide rule. No medals awarded to the graph paper. No statues erected for the statistician who saw the future in the intersection of two curves and was dismissed as a pessimist. Yet the Second World War was decided not in the moment a Tiger tank outgunned a Sherman, or when a U-boat captain lined up a perfect torpedo shot, or when a Luftwaffe ace rolled into a firing position. It was decided in the moment when one line crossed another on a chart in a basement, and the crossing became irreversible. The lesson is simple, brutal, and eternal. Modern war is mathematics in motion. Courage matters, strategy matters, tactics matter. But when industrial capacity diverges beyond a certain threshold, brilliance becomes irrelevant. An army can win every battle and still lose the war if the enemy can replace losses faster than they accumulate. This was the war the Allies fought, not primarily a war of maneuver or firepower, but a war of production, transportation, and supply. A war where victory was constructed in shipyards in Oregon, refined in depots in Kansas, and delivered on trucks driven by men whose names appeared in no history books. The Wehrmacht was defeated by arithmetic before it was defeated by arms. The illusion of superiority. In 1942, German staff officers possessed every reason for confidence. Their tanks were better. Their infantry tactics were proven. Their generals had studied operational art at a level the Allies were only beginning to understand. But superiority at the tactical level is meaningless if the strategic foundation collapses. A Panther tank could destroy 3 Shermans before being knocked out. The exchange rate favored Germany, but if the Allies could build 5 Shermans for every Panther and deliver them to the front faster than they were destroyed, the exchange rate became a pathway to defeat. Quality is a luxury afforded by quantity. When quantity fails, quality becomes a museum piece. The German High Command understood production in static terms, factories operating at capacity, resources allocated efficiently, output maximized within available constraints. What they failed to grasp was that American industry did not operate within constraints. It redefined them. When Liberty ship production was deemed too slow, the Allies did not optimize the existing process. They invented a new one: prefabrication, modular construction, welding instead of riveting. The line did not improve incrementally. It jumped. When fuel supply became a bottleneck, the Allies did not ration more carefully. They built pipelines under the ocean and tankers by the hundred. The constraint was not accepted. It was eliminated. This was not superior strategy. It was superior philosophy, a belief that logistics could be engineered, that supply could be industrialized, that the rules of scarcity could be rewritten if enough resources were applied with enough ruthlessness. The Allies did not win because they fought better. They won because they built a system in which fighting better became optional. The crossover principle. Every graph tells a story, But only one moment in that story is irreversible: the crossover. In the Atlantic, the crossover occurred in May 1943. Merchant ship construction exceeded sinkings, and the gap widened every month thereafter. Donitz could sink 100 ships per month and still lose the tonnage war. The line had crossed, and no tactical brilliance could uncross it. In the air, the crossover occurred over the winter of 1943-1944. Allied replacement rates exceeded German attrition rates, and pilot experience became a one-way accumulation. The Luftwaffe could win individual dogfights and still lose air superiority. The numbers did not care about aces. On land, the crossover occurred at Normandy. Discharge rates exceeded consumption rates, and supply became a self-sustaining tide. The Wehrmacht could destroy bridges, shell depots, and ambush convoys. The tonnage kept coming. Once a line crosses in logistics, it imposes a gravitational pull on every subsequent engagement. Tactics become constrained by fuel. Strategy becomes constrained by ammunition. Operations become constrained by the inability to move. The side below the crossover fights under an invisible ceiling. The side above it operates on an open plateau. Germany fought the entire war after May 1943 from below the crossover. Every offensive was a gamble against arithmetic. Every defense was a delay against inevitability. The line crossed, and history moved with it. The human element in an equation. The line was not drawn by machines. It was drawn by human beings, welders working night shifts in California, crane operators unloading ships in the rain, truck drivers navigating blacked-out roads through enemy territory, engineers calculating stress loads on floating piers, quartermasters counting crates in warehouses that stretched to the horizon. These were not the names that appeared in dispatches or the faces that appeared in newsreels. But their work was the foundation on which every named victory was built. A dock worker in Liverpool, who loaded 50 tons of ammunition in an 8-hour shift, contributed as much to the fall of Berlin as any tank crew that fired those shells. A truck driver on the Red Ball Express who delivered fuel for 12 hours straight enabled advances that generals claimed as operational genius. War is the sum of individual actions aggregated into systems. And in the Second World War, the Allied system outperformed the German system not because it was more heroic, but because it was more scalable. Heroism does not multiply. Logistics does. The Red Ball Express moved 12,000 tons per day with 6,000 trucks and drivers who worked in anonymity. The Wehrmacht could not have replicated that capacity with twice the vehicles because it lacked the doctrinal flexibility to treat logistics as a primary combat arm rather than a support function. The Allies understood what the Germans did not, that in industrial war the rear is the front. The factory is the battlefield. The supply clerk is the infantry. And the pencil that draws the line is as deadly as the rifle that fires the bullet. Truth is a weapon. Wagenführer's charts were not classified because they contained secrets. They were ignored because they contained truths that contradicted belief. The numbers showed that American production claims were not propaganda, that Liberty ships were being built faster than U-boats could sink them, that Allied fuel supply was not a bottleneck but a surplus, that the logistical foundation for an invasion of Europe was already in place by mid-1943. The data was available. The conclusion was unavoidable, but conclusions that threaten existing assumptions are rarely accepted until reality forces acknowledgement. By then, it is too late. This is the quiet tragedy of the statistician's war, not that he was wrong, but that he was right, and no one with authority chose to act on the information. The red X slashed across his graph was not a refutation of the data, it was a refusal to see. In modern war, the deadliest enemy is not the adversary across the line. It is the illusion that the line will not move. The pencil and the slide rule. In the end, the tools that mattered most were not guns or tanks or aircraft. They were the instruments of calculation and projection. The pencil that drew the curve, the slide rule that measured the intersection, the mind that understood what the crossing meant. The war was fought in factories and shipyards, on convoy routes and supply roads, in depots and rail yards. But it was won in the moment when one statistician looked at two lines approaching each other and understood that when they met, the war would be decided. He was not a general. He did not command divisions. He did not fly missions or storm beaches. But he saw the future in the slope of a line and the crossing of an axis. And in the algebra of war, foresight is the only invincible weapon. The lines crossed. The outcome followed. And the lesson remains. In a conflict between arithmetic and belief, arithmetic always wins. It does not care about courage. It does not pause for strategy. It does not negotiate. It simply moves. And when the line crosses, the war is over, whether or not the fighting has stopped. Berlin, May 8, 1945. The basement under Wilhelmstrasse was silent. The lights had failed weeks earlier. Dust lay thick on the steel table where charts had once been pinned, analyzed, updated, and ignored. The pencil was still there, half buried under rubble from the collapsed ceiling. The slide rule lay beside it, cracked but intact, its logarithmic scales frozen at the last calculation anyone had bothered to make. No one would return for them. The war was over. The Reich was ash. The lines that had been drawn in this room, lines of projection, prediction, and warning, had proven true in every particular. But truth without listeners is only an echo in an empty space. Above the ruins, Soviet soldiers searched the ministry buildings for documents, maps, intelligence, anything that might explain how an empire had collapsed so completely. They would find procurement records, battle reports, strategic assessments. They would not find the charts that had mattered most. Those charts were buried under stone and silence, their lines obscured by the debris of a regime that had mistaken confidence for knowledge and belief for reality. Across the Atlantic, a different archive. In a warehouse in Alexandria, Virginia, crates were being stacked floor to ceiling. Inside them, records of production, shipment, and delivery. Manifests listing every Liberty ship launched, every truck manufactured, every ton of fuel refined and transported. Numbers that had once been projections were now history. The lines that had climbed so steeply on Wagenführer's charts had materialized as convoys, divisions, air wings, and invasions. The arithmetic had been correct. The future had arrived exactly as the graphs had predicted. A junior logistics officer, cataloging the files for long-term storage, paused at a sheet labeled Atlantic Crossover Analysis, May 1943. The graph showed two lines intersecting, one falling, one rising. A pencil mark circled the month of the crossing. He had never heard of Rolf Wagenführer. He did not know that a similar chart had existed in a basement in Berlin, or that a statistician had watched the future arrive in the shape of a curve and been powerless to make anyone act on it. But he understood the graph, and he understood what it meant. The war had been won before the decisive battles were fought. Won in the moment when industrial output exceeded consumption, when replacement exceeded attrition, when logistics became a self-sustaining system immune to tactical disruption. He filed the document and moved to the next crate. The warehouse smelled of cardboard and ink. Outside, the Potomac flowed quietly toward the sea. A road in France, the memory of motion. The Red Ball route was empty now. The convoys had stopped. The trucks had been redistributed, sold as surplus or scrapped for parts. The road remained, worn smooth by 10,000 wheels, marked by ruts that would take years to fade. A French farmer, walking his field near Chartres, found a jerry can half buried in the dirt. American markings. Empty. He set it upright by the roadside and continued on. He did not know the name of the driver who had dropped it, or the number of tons that driver had delivered, or the battles that fuel had enabled. But he knew the road. Everyone knew the road. It had been a line drawn across his country in steel and rubber, a logistical artery that had pulsed with purpose for 82 days and then gone still. The line had moved, and history had moved with it. The harbor that became a symbol. At Arromanches, the remnants of Mulberry Harbor still jutted from the waves, concrete caissons, rusted pierheads, fragments of the floating roadways that had once carried the weight of an invasion. Fishermen used them as anchoring points. Children climbed on them at low tide. Tourists photographed them without quite understanding what they represented. They were not monuments. They were functional structures that had outlasted their function. But in their persistence, they carried a lesson. that the most decisive weapons are not the ones that destroy, but the ones that deliver, that the bridge matters more than the sword, that the line from supply to soldier is the line between victory and collapse. The harbor had been built to last 6 months. It had lasted exactly as long as needed, and then been abandoned to the sea. Purpose fulfilled. Line completed. The pencil that drew the future. Somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, buried beneath stones and silence, a pencil lay waiting for no one. Its graphite tip had traced arcs of prediction that became arcs of history. Its lines had been dismissed as fantasy, and then proven as fact. It had drawn the future, and the future had arrived exactly as drawn. In another office, in another capital, another pencil moved across another graph, mapping production, calculating capacity, projecting power. The war was over, but the logic endured. Lines would cross again. Capacities would diverge. One side would build faster than the other could destroy, and the outcome would be decided not in battle, but in the moment when the graphs intersected and stayed intersected. This is the legacy of the war that was fought on paper before it was fought in the field. That in the calculus of modern conflict, the line that crosses first crosses last. That logistics is destiny. That arithmetic is strategy. And that the most unbreakable walls are not made of steel or concrete, but of belief. Belief that refuses to see the numbers until the numbers have already rewritten the world. The line that stays crossed. The Second World War ended in fire and surrender, in rubble and relief. But it had been decided years earlier, in shipyards and factories, on convoy routes and supply roads, in the invisible network of production and transportation that transformed industrial capacity into military outcome. The battles were real. The heroism was real. The suffering was immeasurable. But the result was inevitable from the moment the lines crossed and did not cross back. Wagenführer had seen it. The charts had shown it. The data had confirmed it. And in the end, the only victory that mattered was the one written not in blood, but in the merciless algebra of tons delivered, fuel burned, and replacements arriving faster than losses could accumulate. The war was a duel of lines, on paper and in motion. One side drew curves of optimism and dismissed them as impossible. The other side built the curves into reality and made the impossible routine. The pencil wrote the future. The slide rule measured the crossing. And the line, once crossed, became the border between defeat and survival, between empire and rubble, between the world that was and the world that would be. In the end, the strongest weapon was the simplest, the understanding that in modern war, the graph is the battlefield, and the line that moves fastest wins. The lines moved, the world moved with them. And the lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in the slope of a curve and the inevitability of its intersection. When arithmetic and belief collide, arithmetic does not compromise. It simply crosses the line and stays there.